There's a stretch of water in Central America, less than 50 miles long, that the United States once called worth going to war over. Not metaphorically, literally. In 1989, American troops moved into Panama, tanks in the streets. A president dragged out of a foreign embassy. And at the center of it all, not oil, not ideology, a canal. You've probably crossed it in your mind 100 times without knowing it. Every time a container ship carries something to your local port. Every time a headline mentions shipping delays, or China, or a choke point in global trade. That canal is doing something in the background of your life right now. So here's the question worth sitting with. How does a ditch dug through a jungle end up deciding who controls the flow of the entire world's goods? And why does a country the size of South Carolina still get to hold that leverage over empires 100 times its size? That's where we're going today. To understand the Panama Canal, you have to start somewhere unexpected, not with a canal at all, but with a failure. In the 1880s, a Frenchman named Ferdinand de Lesseps arrived in Panama convinced he could repeat the greatest engineering triumph of his life. A decade earlier, he had built the Suez Canal, a flat, dry, forgiving stretch of desert connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It made him a national hero. It made investors rich. And it made him believe, dangerously, that geography bends to willpower. Panama was not Suez. Panama was jungle, mountain, and disease. Malaria and yellow fever moved through the workforce like a curse nobody understood yet. This was before anyone knew mosquitoes were the carrier. Men dropped by the thousands. Estimates placed the death toll of the French effort at over 20,000 workers. The company went bankrupt in 1889, one of the largest financial collapses of the 19th century, dragging down small investors across France who had trusted a hero's name on a prospectus. De Lesseps died in disgrace. The jungle had won. But here's the part that matters for understanding power, not just history. The failure didn't kill the idea. It just changed who would try next, and revealed something that would define the next century of geopolitics. Whoever finished this canal wouldn't just be solving an engineering problem. They would be building a piece of infrastructure so valuable that owning it would mean owning leverage over the entire Western Hemisphere's trade. The United States was watching. And the United States, at the turn of the 20th century, was a country beginning to think like an empire without quite admitting it to itself. President Theodore Roosevelt didn't see a canal. He saw a lever. A young, ambitious America had just fought a war with Spain, acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and was starting to understand something the old European powers had known for centuries. Control the water, and you control the trade. Control the trade, and you control the wealth. Control the wealth, and eventually you control the outcome of wars you haven't even fought yet. There was only one problem. Panama, in 1903, wasn't its own country. It was a province of Colombia. And Colombia's government, understandably, wasn't thrilled about handing over a strip of its own territory to a foreign power, even one offering money. So Roosevelt did something that reads, even by the standards of early 20th century power politics, as breathtakingly direct. When Colombia's Senate rejected the treaty that would have granted the U.S. canal rights, Washington quietly backed a Panamanian independence movement. American warships appeared off the coast. Weeks later, Panama declared independence from Colombia, and within days, the brand new nation signed a treaty granting the United States control over a strip of land through the middle of its own country in perpetuity. Roosevelt would later boast, in a speech that historians still quote with a kind of stunned discomfort, that he took the isthmus. not negotiated for it, not purchased it outright in a conventional sense. Took it. This is the moment worth sitting with, because it's the seed of everything that follows in this story. A piece of geography so valuable that a great power was willing to help manufacture a new country just to control it. Construction began in 1904, and this time it worked. Not because Americans were braver than the French, but because they solved the actual problem. Colonel William Gorgas, an army physician, ran an aggressive campaign against mosquitoes, draining swamps and fumigating buildings, and yellow fever cases collapsed. Chief Engineer John Stevens redesigned the entire approach, abandoning the French dream of a sea-level canal in favor of a system of locks, massive concrete chambers that would raise and lower ships like a staircase of water, climbing over the terrain instead of trying to cut through it. It took a decade. It cost tens of thousands more lives, mostly West Indian laborers whose names rarely made it into the history books written back in Washington. And in August 1914, the same month the First World War broke out in Europe, the Panama Canal opened for its first official transit. The timing is almost too poetic to be real. As the old European order was about to tear itself apart in the trenches, a new kind of power, infrastructural, logistical, geographic, quietly opened for business on the other side of the Atlantic. Nobody in the capitals of Europe was paying much attention that week. They had other things on their minds. But history has a long memory for leverage. And what had just been built in Panama wasn't simply a shortcut for ships. It was a choke point, a place where the flow of the entire world's trade could be, in theory, turned on or off by whoever held the keys. For the next 65 years, those keys belonged to the United States. For most of the 20th century, the Panama Canal Zone was, in practical terms, a piece of the United States that happened to sit inside someone else's country. Not a base, not an embassy. An actual strip of land, roughly 10 miles wide, running the length of the canal, with American schools, American courts, American police, American currency, and American flags flying over it for decades. Panamanians could look at a map of their own nation and see a scar cut straight through the middle of it, governed by a foreign power, generation after generation. If you want to understand why so much of the resentment toward American power in Latin America runs as deep as it does, this is one of the places to start. Not an abstract grievance. A literal line on a map, drawn by someone else, enforced by someone else's soldiers. For the first few decades, Panama had little leverage to change this. The canal was too valuable, and the U.S. Navy was too dominant for a small nation to negotiate from a position of strength. But leverage in geopolitics doesn't stay fixed forever. It shifts, sometimes because of new alliances, sometimes because of new technology, and sometimes because of something as simple as a national mood finally reaching a boiling point. That boiling point came on January 9, 1964. Panamanian students attempted to raise their national flag alongside the American one at a high school inside the canal zone. A small symbolic act agreed to in principle years earlier, but never consistently honored. It turned violent. Confrontations spread across the zone within hours. By the time the unrest settled, more than 20 Panamanians and several Americans were dead. Panama briefly severed diplomatic relations with the United States entirely. Washington could no longer treat the canal zone as a settled, permanent arrangement. What had been framed for 60 years as a purely engineering and commercial matter was now, undeniably, a live political wound, one with a body count. It took over a decade of negotiation, but in 1977, President Jimmy Carter did something that many in his own country considered close to unthinkable. He signed a treaty agreeing to hand the canal back to Panama by the year 1999. The backlash inside the United States was fierce. Critics, including a rising political figure named Ronald Reagan, argued that giving up the canal meant giving up American strength itself, that a great power does not simply relinquish strategic leverage because a smaller nation asks for its dignity back. The debate in the U.S. Senate was brutal, and the treaty passed by only the narrowest possible margin. But Carter's argument was different and worth understanding on its own terms. Holding on to a resented colonial-style possession in someone else's country wasn't strength. It was a liability wrapped in the appearance of strength, a permanent source of instability, resentment, and potential conflict in a region the U.S. would rather have as a stable partner than an occupied subject. The handover was gradual, deliberate, staged across 2 decades to avoid shock to either country's economy or security posture. And on December 31, 1999, at the stroke of noon, the Panama Canal became, for the first time in its modern history, fully and completely Panamanian. It's worth pausing on how remarkable that moment actually was, because it doesn't fit the story we usually tell about great powers and the infrastructure they build. Empires do not, historically, give back their choke points. Britain did not walk away from Suez by choice. It was forced out, humiliated, in 1956. Great powers, as a rule, hold on until they are made to let go. The United States, for all its flaws in how it acquired the canal in the first place, chose, under sustained pressure, but chose, to hand back one of the most strategically valuable pieces of infrastructure on Earth. And this is where the story gets interesting again, because handing over control doesn't mean handing over interest. The United States retained something quietly enormous in that same 1977 treaty: the permanent right, under the Neutrality Treaty, to defend the canal militarily if its neutrality or open access were ever threatened, by anyone, including Panama itself. Read that again. The U.S. gave up ownership but reserved the right to intervene by force to keep the canal open. Panama got sovereignty over the land. Washington kept on paper something closer to a permanent option on the outcome. For 25 years, that arrangement sat quietly in the background, rarely discussed, rarely tested. Panama ran its own canal, expanded it in 2016 with a new set of larger locks to handle modern container ships, and built a reputation as one of the more stable, canal-dependent economies in Latin America. But infrastructure this valuable never stays quiet forever. Because while the United States and Panama were settling their own long, complicated relationship, a third country was watching the canal with an entirely different kind of interest, one that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with the future of global trade. That country was China. And what it started doing near the canal, quietly, over the following 2 decades, would eventually bring an American president back to the negotiating table, not to hand over more control this time, but to demand some of it back. By the early 2000s, Panama's newly sovereign canal authority needed something every profitable piece of infrastructure eventually needs: partners to run the parts around it, ports, terminals, logistics hubs. The canal itself is a strip of locks and water, but a shipping route lives or dies on what happens at either end of it: the ports where containers actually get loaded, unloaded, and moved onto trucks and trains. In 1997, 2 years before the handover was even complete, Panama awarded a concession to operate the ports at both entrances of the canal, Balboa on the Pacific side, Cristobal on the Atlantic side, to a company called Hutchison Port Holdings, part of a conglomerate based in Hong Kong. At the time, this barely registered as a geopolitical event. Hong Kong, in 1997, was still transitioning under the one country, two systems framework, and a port operating company signing a commercial concession looked like exactly that: a commercial deal. ports get leased to operators all over the world. Nobody was drawing a red line connecting a shipping terminal to a rising superpower's global strategy. But strategies don't always announce themselves the moment they start. Sometimes they accumulate, quietly, for 20 years, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Through the 2000s and 2010s, China's presence around the canal grew in ways that were individually modest but collectively significant. Chinese state-linked companies invested in Panamanian infrastructure, a convention center, a bridge over the canal itself, ports elsewhere on the isthmus. In 2017, Panama made a decision that stunned Washington more than almost anything else in the region that year. It severed its long-standing diplomatic recognition of Taiwan and formally recognized Beijing instead, joining China's Belt and Road Initiative shortly after. The sprawling global infrastructure and investment program through which China has extended influence across ports, railways, and roads from Southeast Asia to East Africa to Latin America. None of this, on its own, put a Chinese warship in the canal or handed Beijing legal control over the locks. Panama's government has consistently stated, publicly and repeatedly, that the canal itself remains fully and solely under Panamanian sovereign control, operated by the Panama Canal Authority, an autonomous Panamanian government agency, not by any foreign company or state. But leverage in geopolitics rarely requires outright ownership. It requires proximity, dependency, and optionality. And by the 2020s, a Hong Kong-based conglomerate with deep, documented ties to mainland Chinese commercial interests was operating the port infrastructure sitting at both mouths of one of the most strategically vital waterways on Earth. That distinction between operating nearby ports and controlling the canal is precise, important, and also, politically, almost irrelevant. Because in Washington, a different set of instincts had already been triggered. The same instinct that drove Theodore Roosevelt in 1903, the same instinct that drove Jimmy Carter's critics in 1977. The instinct that says, whoever sits closest to the choke point eventually gets to ask questions about who controls it. By 2024 and into 2025, this resurfaced in American politics with startling directness. President Donald Trump, both during his campaign and after returning to office, repeatedly and publicly asserted that the United States had been treated unfairly under the 1999 handover, claimed, without the Panamanian government agreeing with this characterization, that China was effectively operating the canal through its port concessions, and stated that the U.S. would consider reclaiming control of the canal if its interests weren't respected, at one point declining to rule out the use of military or economic pressure to do so. Panama's government pushed back firmly and publicly, reiterating that the canal is Panamanian, that its neutrality is enshrined in treaty and international law, and that no Chinese entity operates or controls the canal itself. Only commercial port terminals under concession, like operators from dozens of other countries around the world. It's worth being precise about what is actually contested here, because the loudest version of this story, China controls the canal, is not accurate, and a documentary treatment owes you the more careful version. What's real? A Hong Kong-linked company holds long-standing commercial port concessions at both ends of the canal. Panama has deepened diplomatic and economic ties with Beijing over the past decade, and this has made a small number of very powerful people in Washington deeply uncomfortable about a piece of infrastructure they consider existentially important to American trade and naval logistics. Roughly 40% of U.S. container traffic passes through the canal each year. What's contested and unresolved? Whether that discomfort justifies treaty renegotiation, economic pressure, or anything resembling the kind of intervention Roosevelt and Carter's era knew all too well. In early 2025, under this pressure, the same Hong Kong-based conglomerate agreed to sell its port interests, including the Panama Canal concessions, to a consortium led by American investment firm BlackRock. A deal reportedly worth over $20 billion, covering ports far beyond Panama alone. Beijing's state media criticized the sale, and Chinese regulators moved to review the transaction. And as of this recording, the deal's final shape and whether it will close as originally structured remains unresolved, tangled in a mix of antitrust review, geopolitics, and diplomatic pressure from both Washington and Beijing simultaneously. Which brings us to the actual question sitting underneath all of this, the one this entire video has been building toward. So here's the actual question, stripped of the noise. Why does a strip of water 50 miles long still have the power to pull the gravitational field of three great powers toward it, more than a century after it was built? The answer isn't really about ships. It's about a much older and simpler truth of power, one that shows up again and again throughout this story, if you know where to look. Geography doesn't change, but the value of geography does. And whoever controls the choke points of a given era ends up holding leverage that's wildly disproportionate to their actual size. Think about what Panama actually is, stripped of the canal. A country of roughly 4.5 million people. No large military. No nuclear arsenal. No seat at the table in the way a G7 nation has a seat at the table. And yet, for over a century, Panama has occupied space in the strategic thinking of Washington, and now Beijing, that nations 100 times its size can only envy. That's the paradox worth sitting with. Panama's power was never built on population, or army size, or natural resources pulled from the ground. It was built entirely on position, on being the one place on the map where two oceans could be made to meet. Move the same country somewhere else on the globe, remove the isthmus, and Panama becomes a footnote. Keep it exactly where it is, carve a channel through it, and it becomes a permanent fixture in the calculations of superpowers. This is the pattern historians of infrastructure and strategy keep returning to. Choke points don't just serve trade, they discipline behavior. The moment a valuable flow of goods, energy, or capital is forced to pass through a narrow, controllable space, every major power with a stake in that flow suddenly has to think about who's standing at the narrow part. The Strait of Hormuz does this for oil. The Strait of Malacca does this for trade between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. The Suez Canal does this for the shortest sea route between Europe and Asia. And the Panama Canal does this for trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific, without which every ship would need to sail all the way around the tip of South America, adding weeks and enormous cost to a journey. That's the leverage in concrete terms. Roughly 6% of all global maritime trade passes through the Panama Canal in a given year. For the United States specifically, close to 40% of its container traffic, the flow of consumer goods, parts, and materials that quietly stock every store shelf and factory floor in the country, moves through it. When a choke point carries that much weight, the question of who can, in theory, slow it down, tax it, or close it stops being a hypothetical for policymakers. It becomes the kind of scenario war colleges actually study. And this is where the deeper anxiety in Washington actually comes from. Not from China owning the canal, because it doesn't, but from something more unsettling. The idea that dependency itself is a form of vulnerability, even when nothing has gone wrong yet. A nation doesn't need to lose control of a choke point to feel threatened by it. It only needs to imagine a future scenario, a crisis, a conflict, a moment of maximum pressure, where the party operating the port infrastructure nearby might have interests that don't align with its own. That fear doesn't require evidence of wrongdoing. It only requires proximity and the passage of time. This is precisely why the language coming out of Washington in 2025 sounded less like a trade dispute and more like the language of the early 20th century. The language of Theodore Roosevelt. The language of empires thinking in terms of leverage rather than contracts. Because underneath the modern vocabulary of concessions, consortiums, and antitrust review, the same old question from 1903 was quietly resurfacing. Who gets to hold the keys to the world's choke points, and what happens when a rising power starts standing a little too close to one? Panama, for its part, has spent the past century learning a hard lesson about what it means to be a small country sitting on an asset every empire wants a piece of. Independence in 1903 didn't end its entanglement with American power. It began it on American terms. Full sovereignty in 1999 didn't end great power interest in the canal either. It simply changed the shape of who came calling next. First, it was the United States asking Colombia. Then, it was Panama negotiating with the United States. Now it's Panama caught, again, between Washington and Beijing, trying to hold on to the one thing that has defined its entire modern existence: control over the ground beneath its own most valuable asset. There's a version of this story that ends in conflict, a scenario openly discussed in some Washington circles, where the U.S. uses economic or even military pressure to force a renegotiation of the treaty framework itself. There's another version where the BlackRock-led consortium's acquisition closes cleanly, Chinese-linked port operators genuinely exit the concessions, and the entire controversy quietly resolves itself through ordinary commercial channels, the way Panama's government has consistently said it should. As of this recording, which version we're heading toward remains genuinely unresolved. And that uncertainty is, itself, the story. Not because nobody knows the facts, because the facts are still being written, in boardrooms and ministries, even as you're hearing this. What the last 120 years of Panama Canal history actually teaches isn't a lesson about ships or locks, or even about Panama specifically. It's a lesson about the nature of power itself in an interconnected world. The things that make a country matter most are rarely the loudest things. They're rarely armies, or speeches, or headlines. Often, they're a 50-mile strip of water that two oceans happen to need, and the quiet, patient, decades-long game of whoever gets to stand closest to it. There's a version of the Panama Canal story that most people never think about because it doesn't involve treaties or presidents or warships. It involves a truck driver in Ohio who has never heard of Balboa or Cristobal, and a retired teacher in Arizona who has never once thought about the Isthmus of Panama. And yet, both of their lives are quietly threaded through those 50 miles of water every single week. That's the part of choke point power that rarely makes it into the history books because it doesn't announce itself. It just shows up, invisibly, in the price of things. When a drought hit Panama in 2023 and lowered water levels in the artificial lake that feeds the canal's locks, authorities had to cut the number of ships allowed through each day. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a treaty dispute. It was rainfall. And within weeks, shipping costs on certain routes spiked, delivery windows stretched, and companies as far away as retailers in the American Midwest were quietly rerouting cargo around the tip of South America, adding weeks to delivery times and real dollars to the cost of getting a product to a shelf. Nobody declared this a crisis on the evening news. There was no flag raised, no soldier deployed. But somewhere in that stretch of weeks, a small manufacturer had to explain to a customer why an order was late. A shipping company had to eat a cost it hadn't budgeted for. And that cost, eventually, in the way costs always do, found its way into a price tag somewhere in America. This is the quiet, unglamorous truth about choke points. Their power doesn't usually announce itself through headlines. It shows up through delay, through a few extra cents on a container, through a supply chain quietly rerouting itself around a problem most people will never learn existed. Power, at this scale, doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. It just needs to be depended upon. And this is exactly why the anxiety in Washington over who sits near the canal isn't simply theater for a domestic political audience, even though some of the rhetoric certainly plays that way. Underneath the noise is a genuine structural reality. The United States built the most powerful economy in human history on a foundation of assuming that certain physical flows of oil, of goods, of raw materials would remain reliably open. For most of the 20th century, American naval dominance made that assumption safe to make. You didn't need to worry about a choke point if your navy could, in the worst case, simply keep it open by force. But naval dominance doesn't erase a much older question. What happens to a great power's assumptions when the world stops looking like the world it built its assumptions in? China, in 2025, isn't a naval power that can challenge the U.S. fleet ship for ship in the Western Hemisphere. Nobody serious is suggesting the People's Liberation Army Navy is going to contest Panama by force. But military dominance was never the only way to gain leverage over a choke point. Commercial presence, patient investment, decades of quiet infrastructure deals, diplomatic recognition, port concessions. These are all slower instruments, but they're instruments nonetheless. And they're exactly the instruments China has spent the last 25 years learning to use, not just in Panama, but in ports and infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Which raises the real, uncomfortable question sitting underneath the entire Panama Canal story. A question this video isn't going to fully answer, because nobody has fully answered it yet. In a world where the most valuable form of leverage is no longer simply whose navy is bigger, but whose money, whose companies, and whose long-term patience built the deepest roots into the world's choke points. What does power actually mean anymore? Roosevelt's generation understood power as something you took directly, with warships and manufactured revolutions. Carter's generation understood power as something you could afford to give away, strategically, in exchange for stability and goodwill. This generation, the one watching a Hong Kong-linked port operator sell to an American consortium under Chinese regulatory scrutiny, while the treaty framework from 1977 gets quietly reread in Washington think tanks, is still figuring out what its own definition of power even is. Maybe that's the most honest way to end this chapter of the story. Not with a resolution, because there isn't one yet, but with a recognition of what Panama has always represented, whether the surrounding empires were French, American, or increasingly Chinese. It has never been the biggest, the strongest, or the loudest voice in the room. It has simply been the ground beneath something everyone else needed. And for over 120 years, that has been enough to keep the eyes of the world's great powers fixed on a 50-mile strip of water that most of those powers' own citizens couldn't find on a map. Because in the end, this was never really a story about a canal. It's a story about how a nation can become powerful not by being big, but by being necessary, and how that kind of power, quiet and geographic and patient, can outlast empires, outlast treaties, and outlast every single person who ever thought they had finally settled the question of who controls it. But Panama isn't the only place on Earth where a country has learned to turn geography itself into leverage. Because thousands of miles away, in the mountains and river valleys of a different continent, another rising power has spent the last 2 decades building something far larger than a canal. A network of roads and rail lines threading through a dozen countries, engineered not by an accident of geology, but on purpose, from scratch. And what that country has built raises the same question the Panama Canal has been asking for over a century, just at a much bigger scale. What happens when a nation stops waiting for a choke point to exist and simply builds one instead? If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the loud 5-minute headline version, but the slower, deeper one, where you actually understand why the world works the way it does. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because there's a comment I imagine some of you are already forming, watching this unfold. Something like, isn't this just what powerful countries always do? Find the leverage point, lean on it, and call it strategy? Maybe. But there's something specific about choke points that makes them different from ordinary leverage, and it's worth naming before we move forward. You can't build a second Panama Canal next door if the first one stops cooperating. Geography, unlike a factory or a trade agreement, can't simply be replicated somewhere more convenient. That scarcity is exactly what makes choke points so valuable, and exactly what makes the countries sitting on top of them so hard to ignore, no matter how small they are on a map. Which is why, if you want to understand the next chapter of this same story, the one where a great power decided it was tired of depending on choke points it didn't control and built its own instead, you have to look at what China has spent the last 2 decades constructing across Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and East Africa. Roads cut through mountain ranges that engineers once called impossible. Rail lines connecting landlocked provinces to ports that didn't exist 20 years ago. Ports themselves, built or financed by Chinese state capital, in countries that could never have afforded to build them on their own. This wasn't an accident of geology, the way Panama's isthmus was. It was infrastructure as foreign policy, built deliberately, one project at a time, under a banner China calls the Belt and Road Initiative. A strategy this channel has been circling from the very first minute of this video, because it's the same instinct that drove Roosevelt to take the isthmus in 1903, just inverted. Instead of taking an existing choke point by force, build new ones by design, and let the debt, the dependency, and the diplomacy follow naturally behind the concrete. Some of the countries that took China's money to build these roads are now discovering something Panama learned the hard way a century ago. That infrastructure, built by someone else's capital, rarely stays free of someone else's influence. And some are discovering something else entirely, that for the first time in decades, they finally have leverage of their own. That tension between opportunity and dependency, between a road that connects you to the world and a road that quietly owns a piece of you, is where we're headed next. Here's what stays with me about this story, long after the treaties and the port concessions fade into the background. Panama never had the biggest army, never had the deepest pockets, never had a seat at the table when the great powers of any era sat down to decide how the world's trade would move. And yet, for over 120 years, it has never once been ignored. Roosevelt didn't ignore it. Carter didn't ignore it. And whatever comes out of Washington and Beijing in the years ahead, neither will they. That's the part worth sitting with, longer than the politics of any single year. Power, the kind that actually lasts, was never really about size. It was about position, about becoming the one place the rest of the world simply cannot route around. Empires rise, empires retreat, flags change on maps, and treaties get renegotiated by men who are certain, each time, that they're the ones finally settling the question for good. The canal doesn't care. It just sits there, doing what it's always done. letting the water rise, letting the water fall, deciding quietly whose ships get through today. Maybe that's the real lesson underneath all of it. Not who wins the argument over Panama, but how much of what shapes our lives, the price on a shelf, the speed of a delivery, the quiet decisions of nations we'll never visit, was decided a long time ago by a piece of geography and by the people patient enough to understand what it was worth. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought, and tell me what you want to understand next. Somewhere out there is the next choke point, the next quiet piece of ground that's about to decide more than anyone realizes.